We'll now move to the Association of Reformed Political Action Canada with André Schutten and José Ruba. You have 5 minutes between the two of you.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. Honorable committee members, degrading and harmful practices are wrong and they should be banned. Yet legislators must be nuanced and precise in their definitions to avoid capturing practices and services that are helpful to some. The definition of conversion therapy in C6 is too broad and vague. It captures helpful counseling and psychological support for children, teens, and adults, as my colleague Jose will address in a moment. As it stands, Bill C6 would make it a criminal offense for parents to bring their child to a counselor to address gender dysphoria and for the counselor to help that child. The penalty for both the counselor and the parent is up to 5 years in prison. C6 will also deny to some members of the LGBTQ community the broad range of counseling choices that are freely available to all other Canadians. So in a tragic twist, Bill C6's overly broad definition ends up discriminating against the very people it purports to help, contrary to the Charter. Well, the federal government should be concerned about and legislate on dangerous methods, electrical shock therapy, surgical pharmaceutical interventions, and so on. It must not conflate methods on one hand with goals on the other. And again, Jose will speak about his personal experience with this in a moment. So ARPA Canada supports a well-defined ban on conversion therapy, and our written submissions propose amendments in more detail. I'll just highlight 3 here. First, add the word therapeutic at the beginning of the definition of conversion therapy to focus the scope of this bill and alleviate legitimate concerns of parents, teachers, and spiritual leaders. And second, cut the reference to sexual behavior from the definition because it unfairly prevents members of the LGBTQ community from accessing counseling that's freely available to all other Canadians. And finally, add a clarification that conversion therapy does not include religious teaching on identity and ethics. That would direct police, investigators, and prosecutors to focus their attention not on religious minorities, but rather on outdated therapeutic practices. I now turn it over to my colleague, Jose.
Members of Parliament, thank you for taking the time to hear my comments today. I came to Ottawa as a journalism student years ago, excited to learn about the Canadian rights and freedoms. I'm speaking today because I believe Bill C6 threatens the rights of all Canadians, but especially LGBT Canadians. When I lived in Ottawa, I began to see a counselor to help reduce my unwanted same-sex attractions and behavior. Sadly, those of us who benefit from this counseling are not included in these discussions. That is why I need to share a statement supported by dozens of my friends who've gone through the same experience. We applaud the government if it wishes to pass legislation which criminalizes in an explicit manner coercive counseling practices. But Bill C6 conflates harmful methodologies with the goals Canadians choose for themselves. We are Canadians whose goal was to reduce unwanted sexual behavior or gender confusion. We chose counseling as the methodology to achieve this goal. We were not coerced or harmed by this counseling. Rather, this counseling helped us reduce behaviors we no longer wanted to engage in. For many of us, this counseling saved our lives. But this counseling is threatened by Bill C6's definition of conversion therapy. The definition is not used by any professional body in North America. The Canadian Psychological Association, the Canadian Psychiatric Association, and their American counterparts do not include the phrase reduced non-heterosexual attraction or sexual behavior. Good counseling will always help patients change behavior they no longer want to engage in. There are legitimate reasons why Canadians would want to reduce sexual behavior without changing their orientation. Sexual behavior can include porn or sexual addiction or extramarital affairs. If Bill C6 passes, heterosexuals would be able to get support to reduce these behaviors, but LGBT Canadians will not. Consenting adults will not be able to pay for a professional counselor. Mature minors would have no choice at all. In fact, this bill says that only the counseling sessions of LGBT Canadians will be regulated by criminal law. That will be a violation of our charter rights. Now, the government argues that this bill will not impact a person's gender transition or a person's exploration of their identity or development. But by adding the phrase reduced non-heterosexual attraction or sexual behavior, the government is already telling us what we're allowed to conclude from our exploration. We agree with ARPA's proposed amendments and ask you add coercion to the definition of conversion therapy. We are not asking that you agree with our goals. We are asking you to respect our right to set goals for ourselves. In other words, we are simply asking that you recognize we exist. Thank you.
hear what you are saying on. I certainly support a ban on conversion therapy, but we need to, and key in the work that this committee is doing, we need to get the definition of what is conversion therapy right. And it's alarming to hear that this definition has not been used in any other case. So do you agree with the minister's assessment that this wouldn't apply to good faith conversations between someone exploring their issues around sexuality with the doctor, faith leader, etc.?
I believe that. Thank you very much for the question. I believe that that the writing, the current definition in section 320.101 is too ambiguous to be able to say that for certain one way or the other. And certainly, if I was a criminal defense lawyer, did a little bit of criminal defense work before I came to work where I am now. I would be very, very concerned about the way this definition is written. It's I'm quoting from the Supreme Court of Canada, which has said that it's a fundamental requirement of the rule of law that a person should be able to predict whether a particular act constitutes a crime. And because it's so ambiguous, I think in the definition, I think that all Canadians, particularly the pastors and the doctors that you've just mentioned, Mr. Moore, that they deserve clarity and certainty in the law. It's not here. And so adding a clarification, which has been on the Justice website for a long time, and which the Justice Minister, to his credit, has been emphasizing in his oral remarks, that this doesn't target that, which would be good. But I would say that it needs to be in the law. It has to be in the criminal code.
Yeah, I want to explore that further. On the Department of Justice website, they lay out a paragraph saying this is what this bill doesn't do. And that's been used as a communication piece from the minister. It aligns with what the minister said about the bill in his press conference introducing it. But if we back up just 2 years ago, the federal government was called upon to institute a criminal code ban on conversion therapy. And as you know, criminal code is the highest sanction that we have in Canada. And at the time, the federal government said, well, this is primarily in the domain of the provinces, so we will not introduce criminal code amendments. Fast forward 2 years, and we have this bill. So it's very important that we get the definition right when we're talking about the criminal code. And I agree that individuals need to know where they stand before the law, and having the definition clear is so important. So what would be the downside then of including, there's two for greater certainty type clauses after the definition. What would be the downside of including the language that the department has on their website in the definition?
Thanks again. I don't see a downside to adding that, because there already exists two clarifying statements. A third one, adding greater clarity, again, would be wholly appropriate. And I note as well that there's been multiple briefs submitted to the Justice Committee from a diverse range of witnesses that make this same point. CJ made this submission in written form, and I'd also endorse the very thorough legal research in the brief of the Christian Legal Fellowship as well, where they make the same point. I don't see the downside to adding that clarification.
Difficult topic, and there's varying opinions on it, although I think there's consensus on one thing. Let me give you an example. I was talking to a friend recently. He asked me what I was doing. I told him I was on the Justice Committee and we were discussing legislation banning conversion therapy, and he seemed puzzled. I explained to him what conversion therapy was. He said, well, I didn't even think that was still legal. How can anybody possibly be opposed to this legislation? I said, well, you'd be surprised. There's a number of people who are actually opposed to it, and there are still some people who think that it needs to be further refined. And I think it's the second part of that statement is where we're at on this committee. I think that there's consensus from the witnesses today that banning conversion therapy is vital. Let me start with you, Mr. Schutten. We've heard testimony that you know, this legislation, because of the definition you referred to, it might put a freeze on therapy. It might, and I think you said, it might prevent parents from taking their children for counseling. It might have an impact on a religious environment. With respect, sir, I've looked at this legislation and it simply doesn't do that. I'm receiving a number of calls at my office and emails from people who are saying, look, I'm not going to be able to go to church now, and I'm not going to be able to talk to my priest. And my concern is that some of these thoughts that are being put out there are creating confusion on what the legislation is trying to do. And the goal of the legislation is simply to ban archaic process and approach to dealing with people who want to live their life the way they feel they should. And it's as simple as that. So do you agree with that? And do you agree that there are people out there who are causing a great deal of confusion, which is doing harm to the goal of this legislation?
Thanks for the question. It's important to be, yes, very precise about the definition, and I completely agree with you, sir, about where we're all aligned on this committee and amongst the witnesses. I think that some people have inflated the risk with this particular bill. It won't prohibit any individual from seeking any type of counseling from a pastor, a priest, a religious counselor, and so on. But rather, I think where the ambiguity lies in the bill and in the definition is that it's going, it will, or it will at the very least chill the ability for people who are struggling with questions about personal identity, sexuality, sexual ethics, and so on, who want to seek that kind of help that's in line with perhaps their own religious convictions or other reasons that they want to seek counseling.
Sorry, let me try. I totally disagree with that. I don't think it will have that effect at all, because you're suggesting that doctors and religious counselors and parents are going to misinterpret this law. People are going to be able to do what's appropriate with their own circumstances, their own family. It's up to professionals who are doctors and religious leaders to abide by the law. I don't think that's going to happen at all, unless there are people out there perpetuating this theory wrongfully, in my opinion, because let's get back to the basics here. We have a goal. This legislation has a purpose. Everybody agrees on what it is. Let's not distort that goal by clouding it with issues that people who are opposed to it want to perpetuate. And that's where I think you and I disagree. And I apologize for interrupting.
No problem. May I respond, Madam Chair? Or?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So with respect, then I'd say, well, just take the example of my co-panelist, Mr. Ruba. So he sought out counseling, talk therapy, to try to align his religious convictions, and Jose can speak for himself, of course, but he sought out that counseling from a professional to align his religious convictions with a particular thing that he was struggling with, same-sex attraction, in his words. That service that's offered by the person or the professional that he went to is prohibited by this bill. And I quote to you then the Justice Minister's own words in committee 2 days ago, where he said that talk therapy is covered by this definition. So outdated methods like shock therapy and all kinds of other horrible practices should be banned. Absolutely.
Again, I'm going to interrupt you because I don't have much time. With respect, I disagree with you again. This bill specifically allows for adults to seek therapy if that's what they wish to do. And to quote your colleague, he said we should allow people to set their own goals. And this bill, with respect, does just that. So the prohibition that you've just enunciated, I don't see it in the legislation.
Mm-hmm. So the barrier there is, of course, that professional that Mr. Ruba sought to and got counseling from cannot make money doing it, can't advertise it. And so people like Mr. Ruba, his rights then are interfered with because he can't get that help, whereas every other Canadian can.
He is allowed to get therapy. It is against the law by this legislation for people to promote it, make money, and advertise. Those are two distinctly different things, sir. And I think that's where maybe the confusion lies, but unfortunately I'm out of time.
Thank
I would also like to thank all of the witnesses who are here with us today. I know it isn't easy to appear virtually, but your comments are very useful to our discussions and consideration of the bill, regardless of your particular positions on the provisions. I would like to follow up with Mr. Schutten. He is concerned. Well, I think that everybody agrees that we need to ban conversion therapies. Some witnesses have said we need to go further and ban these therapies for not just minors, but everyone. And some people say that, in fact, discussions, objective, good faith discussions should be allowed with young people. So, for example, if you had a religious leader and young children in that religious community, that could be an example. And of course, a religious leader has influence. What the minister is saying is that good faith conversations should be allowed, and I think those should be non-interventionist. Those should be neutral conversations that don't try to influence somebody as regards their gender identity. So, Mr. Schutten, should a pastor in good faith discussions should not try to influence anybody in their gender identity and sexual orientation? Is there not a bias there already in that conversation?
The thoughtful question. I think that there's a great range of diversity within Canada, in particular religious diversity within Canada, and there are many people also within the LGBTQ community that have particular religious identities, and that they want to make sure that they live that religious identity, faithfully and true, while also dealing with and living out their life as an LGBT individual. And pastors, spiritual leaders, can walk that path. Now, I can only speak from the religious community that I come from, so I can't speak for other religious communities. But certainly within my community, our identity first as children of God and as image bearers of Jesus Christ, that's our primary identity. That's our leading identity. And so if I want to seek help or guidance from a spiritual leader within my tradition, then he's going to lead with that. That's an assumption I have going into the conversation. That's an assumption he's going to have in the conversation as well. And that should be available to me as a Canadian without restriction from the civil government. It should be free to every Canadian to seek out counseling and help, services, practices, counseling that's in line with their religious convictions, and that's not coercive, abusive behavior.
Merci, Monsieur Schutten.
Monsieur Fortin?
Mr. Fortin?
So this is not impacting your time, but one of our witnesses, Erica Muse, has her hand raised. So if you would like, you can also ask her for intervention. It's really up to you.
Je comprends pas, Madame la Présidente.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand. Do I have any time left? Or do you want Erica to be able to speak?
I'm just letting you know that Erica has her hand raised. So if you would like her to comment, you can ask her to.
Yeah, je comprends, mais je veux compléter le sujet d'abord.
I understand, but I just want to follow up with Mr. Schutten because I think the question is important. So, Mr. Schutten, you're talking about a pastor that you might ask for advice or support. Obviously, the pastor is going to try to influence the individual regarding the gender identity or sexual orientation. Is that not true?
Religious convictions of that community to bear, for sure.
Mais c'est justement ce que le projet de loi cherche à interdire, d'influencer quelqu'un.
So that's what is meant by influence. We don't want a young person to be influenced regarding his or her gender identity or sexual orientation. That's what we're trying to avoid.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I want to thank all of the witnesses for your very important testimony as we consider Bill C-6. I'm going to direct my questions to Mr. Ruba. Mr. Ruba, through you, Madam Chair, we've heard from witnesses on Tuesday who expressed concern that Bill C-6 would create a chilling effect on counselors and medical professionals who may fear consequences for providing any services that could help patients like yourself manage unwanted behaviors or attractions. Have you experienced this chill effect?
Yeah, actually, I've already talked to a Christian counselor that I know in Calgary, as many of you know. Bylaw similarly written to the federal law is actually already in place in Calgary. One Christian counselor I talked to has already said that she's very scared about talking about this with her clients. Another pastor told me that she was very scared of even returning the calls of people asking for support from people of her own faith. So the chill effect is real. And in terms of being able to access the service, I disagree with the member, Mr. Maloney, because this bill says I cannot access or pay for a service that everyone else can, based solely on my sexual orientation and faith. That's outright discrimination. And I'm actually pretty saddened and appalled that to people who speak about being able to express and respect the diversity of this country would completely ignore what I just said in terms of a person who benefited from this counseling and freely chose to get it. I represent dozens of people who agree with me on this, and we have a right to at least be acknowledged that we exist. The last testimony we just heard basically said we don't. And that's sad for a group of people who want to argue for diversity.
Mr. Ruba, now the government has provided assurances that your rights won't be infringed upon. You spoke about the effect that the bylaw in Calgary has had on your ability to access counseling services that you freely want to access. Can you speak to the government's assurances that there really is nothing to worry about here?
If there was nothing to worry about, then they wouldn't be able, even having to add information on the website saying conversations wouldn't be included. The problem is, as I said, the addition of the phrase reduction of sexual behavior or non-heterosexual behavior. There are many reasons anyone, even if they don't want to change their sexual orientation or gender identity, would want to reduce sexual behavior, as I mentioned. And there are LGBT people who support what we're saying when it comes to this, because they ought to have the same rights as every other Canadian to access care. There's a difference between banning bad methodologies, which we all agree, and telling Canadians what goals they should be able to achieve. A counselor is like a GPS. You plug in the information and she tells you how to get there. But it's our decision to decide where we want to go. If I choose to be chaste and celibate, which I am, if there's a movie called The 44-Year-Old Virgin, I would be the star. That would be me. But the point is, that's my decision. And if I have a right to be chaste and celibate, then I ought to have the right to choose a counselor that I can pay for, just like everybody else.
And you noted that the definition in the legislation is novel in that no professional body has any similar or same definition as that which is provided for in the bill. Can you speak to that a little more? And as you do so, would you also perhaps just elaborate on changes you would like to see to the bill to ensure that individuals like yourself are not discriminated against from accessing counseling that you desire?
Well, again, just simply adding the word coercion to practice or therapy right at the start of the definition would make this very fair and very safe. and acknowledge the right that people like myself exist. We have a right to access this care. When it comes to being able to just look at the counseling opportunities and the support, if we have a right to choose what our sexual practices are, even if that means choosing to be a virgin until you're 44, then we ought to have a right to get that support. When it comes to what's happening in Calgary now, there is a radical chill effect. What's happening to churches, they're very scared, and they have to actually say, you know, we have to be willing to challenge the law in order to even just to do our job as believers, whether they're Christians, Sikhs, Hindus, or Muslims. There's a billion people who believe when it comes to sexuality that God designed it for a husband and wife in marriage. And we have a right to live according to those beliefs and practice that. What this bill says is your goal is wrong, and it dictates what a religious goal should be. That is not something that jives with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
Thank you.
Psychologist or a pastor and a young person, without trying to influence the youth, you think that that kind of discussions about sexual orientation or gender identity could be allowed?
I believe in good faith conversations, sir, and I support that very much. But I don't agree that any conversations have any kind of lack of influence. And when I studied journalism, one of the arguments we made was, can we actually be objective as journalists? And the answer is no. We all have biases. Your question has a bias leading what you want me to say. And that's absolutely fine. You have a right to do that. All we're asking is that we all have a right to do that. And so as I'm a youth pastor as well, and this kind of law, let me give you an example. If a 14-year-old girl in my youth group came to me and she wanted to have sex with her classmate, I would be able to say as a Christian, we don't support sex before marriage. But if her classmate was a female, not a male, this law would prevent me from giving the exact same counsel. And I don't think that's the right of government to tell me what I should be able to teach my youth group when it comes to what our faith teaches.
Okay. Okay.
All right. So it's all about the influence question. If I understand correctly, for us, it would be unacceptable, whether it be a counselor, a pastor, a neighbor. So it would be unacceptable for someone to try to influence someone with their gender identity. If a young boy was wearing a dress, no one should be allowed to say you're not allowed to wear a dress, but to have an objective conversation. So why wearing a dress? Do you like dresses? So that's the kind of things that we want to allow. So am I right, Mr. Ruba?
Able to respect and show grace.
My
to
sincerest
everybody. That's what we believe as
apologies.
Christians.
We
But
do.
to say that we can't
Sorry,
influence other
sir.
people doesn't work.
Thank you. My apologies. We're out of time.